All right. Coming at you all the way live from the lower bottoms of West Oakland. This is Revolution. Today, I am so lucky to have, and I have to tell the story about today and my guest today. I was all excited to speak to my guest today a few days ago, and we had a whole thing scheduled. And then the melee jumped off at the Capitol building, and my guest goes, "Hey, we got to reschedule because I gotta check out this this stuff that's going on at the Capitol building." Today, I'm speaking with Mike Davis. He's a social commentator, urban theorist, historian, and political activist, professor. He's best known for his investigations of power and social class in his native Southern California. I would say California in general. He's the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship and the Lannan Literary Award. Mr. Mike Davis.
You sound like you're announcing me from the ring.
Of course. You talk some real stuff, Mr. Davis. You don't pull any punches when you talk. So when you write these books, I feel like you're how do you say it? I haven't yelled out right on in reading a book in quite a while, and in reading City of Quartz, I definitely yelled out right on a few times.
Well, I thank you very much. The truth is that until I was about 40 years old and had my first child, I thought of my life primarily as a movement activist, but I really wasn't good at anything. I was a poor public speaker. The guys at work, I worked as a Teamster for a long time, would kind of laugh at me, when I ventured, some of my radical ideas about the union. And by the time I was 40 also, so much of the activism had receded. So the books represent the one thing that I have some skill at, which is writing and research. And literally all of them have been conceived as kind of an exercise in tool making. That is, books that are tools directed toward particularly younger activists across the country. Never particularly had an academic target for any of it.
Hello? Are you still there? Did we lose you? Uh-oh.
Hello?
Mike?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There you go. I didn't hear you for a second. You're still there.
Yeah.
Now so after you watched the goings on of, was it Wednesday? No, Monday.
Yes.
What was your first reaction when you see breaking news coming from the Capitol? What was the first thing that went through your mind?
Well, I, like almost everyone else, I was astounded by the way the passive role of the Capitol Police after we'd seen the brutality against Black Lives Matter demonstrators. But my second thought was, wow, we're watching the splintering of the Republican Party. And for some Republicans, this is a liberation, because their careers and futures are no longer tied to the Trump cult. And I think what we'll see over the next year is really the emergence of two parties, even if they retain the same level of Republican. and one party, which it would be a mistake to call moderate in any way, would be the post-Trump party that's realigned more closely with the traditional business power structures of the Republican Party, and a whole generation of young Turks, primarily in the Senate, the people like Tom Cotton, for instance, from Arkansas, is often mentioned as a presidential candidate.
That's frightening.
They'll retain the alliance with Christian conservatism, and will still be, in fact, a far-right party without Trump. Meanwhile, and the leadership of this is mainly centered in the Senate, and senators, of course, are less prone to being unseated in primaries because of their access to corporate money. So retaliation by Trump is probably going to be, relatively ineffective against many of them. On the other hand, the Trump camp has become virtually a third party. And as we saw in the certification vote, we had over 150 Republicans, the majority of Republicans in the House, rejecting the results of the election. And this party, of course, will continue to have a large presence. And we have to understand that right now, probably all Trump is thinking about is vengeance, taking revenge on Democrats who haven't supported his narrative. And he's in a good position to keep the majority of these seats, at least for a while. Much easier for Trumpites to retaliate against House Democrats than Senate Democrats. So this is quite an epical thing. This is a splintering and realignment of the Republican Party. But must be very careful about celebrating this as the end of the Trump era or the end of the Republicans as a potentially majority party. So many of us, myself included, before 2016, thought the Republican Party was dying despite all of its attempts to restrict voting and disenfranchise people. And of course, quite proven wrong in 2016. So much depends on organizing on the ground, particularly the priority in the union movement of winning back Trump voters, union Trump voters who had previously voted for Obama, who had been lifelong Democrats before.
Which were a lot of the people in that crowd.
Yeah.
Here's a question for you, and I don't know if you've been asked this already. Do you think Donald Trump succeeded where Bernie Sanders didn't even try? So to your point about there's a Trump faction of the Republican Party that's breaking off and kind of forming its own third party. There are people on the left that believe that Bernie Sanders should not have ran within the Democratic Party, but probably should have ran as some sort of third party candidate, especially after he lost the nomination.
No, I think it was a necessary decision. And I think it was a great success, last year's primary campaign. The problem was that eventually all the eggs were put in the electoral basket. The strategy of the Sanders campaign, as we were repeatedly told, and I think most activists in the campaign believe, was inside-outside, to use popular struggles in the workplace, communities, streets, to help elect candidates, and then those candidates in turn to support and reinforce the mass struggles outside of Congress and electoral politics. But as we saw what happened after the Sanders concession in March, was in fact the strategy was almost totally electoral. I mean, Bernie constantly was coming out with these great ideas, applauding the workers who were revolting against unsafe working conditions. But always that was followed by an appeal to contribute to Democratic candidates rather than calling for mass protests. I think one of the greatest failures subjectively was to build a movement in support of the healthcare and other essential workers who were working in conditions of great peril and danger. Although groups of Black Lives Matter activists and some DSA chapters and others did support on a local level actions by workers, there was no national campaign, no national coalition. That would have reshaped the nature of the final campaign. Instead, we allowed, in a way, Trump to capture the whole issue of jobs and economic fears, supported by a short-lived but dramatic recovery of jobs during October. So the absence of protests in the streets and support actions for workers in peril had, I think, very grave consequences. And obviously, we should continue to support progressive caucus in Congress. But the focus now needs to be basically non-electoral. I should add to that the fact that, of course, perhaps some of the listeners are thinking, well, hell, the Trump maniacs were out there without, masks. We couldn't do that. We had to stay home and obey the recommendations. But in fact, as Black Lives Matter protests showed, it was quite possible to have mass protests with everybody wearing masks and to do that safely. There were various predictions that those protests would become super spreader events.
And they didn't. Like
the Republican protests were, but in no case did that happen because people observed the necessary precautions. We should never give up the street under any condition.
I like that. Never give up the street. I've been reading a little bit of Durkheim's concept of enemy. Was it rulelessness? The writer and journalist Chris Hedges speaks about it quite a bit. What is it? Durkheim sees enemy as a state of social disintegration due to a far-reaching social change, industrialization, the introduction of the structural principle of division of labor, social differentiations, the disappearance of old principles of structure and order weakens social cohesion. Do you think that has anything to do with what we saw at the Capitol building and with kind of the rise of figures like Trump?
Well, I mean, Durkheim has been reinstated recently through books like Bowling Alone, and if you read the columns of that deeply wounded conservative David Brooks and the New York Times, he's always talking about this, about the decline of associational activity of community activities of workplace-based friendships and the like. But I think this is grossly understated.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, it hardly applies to the case of African Americans, Chicanos, and immigrant communities. I mean, what we saw in Georgia, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
was an astonishing display of a capacity for self-organization and struggle rooted in the Black communities. Uh, strong structure of solidarity and the institutions that support that, like the churches, for instance. And of course, in the Latino community, immigrant communities, where you have extended families and all kinds of kinship links going back and forth across international borders, I think that enemy hardly applies. You go out in Trump country, and it's a little different because, sure, there are the mega churches,
Mm-hmm.
which have become so important in the grassroots mobilization of Trump voters. But here you have the case, particularly, I talk about this in a recent article, of people who, affluent people, Republicans who moved to the countryside and outer suburbs, and essentially lead these fortress lives, in a sense that they're bunkered down in separation and rejection from any kind of common life with the majority of other Americans. And of course, enemy creates the conditions, particularly for the growth of conspiracy
Mm-hmm.
theory and wild beliefs of different kinds.
And isn't that kind of what we saw too at that Capitol raid? A bunch of QAnon people, of course, the MAGA supporters, people that believe the election was stolen due to false votes. There was an article, I forget, maybe it was in Forbes, I forget where it was, about the woman that got shot in the neck who voted for Obama twice.
Well, she's an interesting case because she grew up a few miles from where I did in eastern San Diego County.
I know exactly that area. I know that area
I grew
well.
up in a now totally forgotten place called Lakeside, called Bostonia, which is midway between the city of El Cajon and the little town of Lakeside. And this is an area. I have Black relatives by marriage, and they couldn't come out and visit us when I was growing up. It was simply too dangerous. This area has a long history
Mm-hmm.
of violence and against people of color and immigrants, including probably about a half dozen murders over the last 25 years. And unsurprisingly, it's a hotbed of Trumpism. She seems to, have been different, initially. But if you're around other people, the pressure to conform to their beliefs and, just the constant bombardment of these claims. And this came from, I think, not only her friends, but from, her family as well. So maybe she wasn't a hopeless case after all.
Mm-hmm.
But we shouldn't kid ourselves about what's happened in this country. 6-7 years ago, we're talking about the majority versus the 99% versus
Yes.
1%.
Yes.
Well, every poll taken since Trump's election and polls that have come out in the last few days show that there's 35 or 40% of voters who are absolutely, rigidly, and unmovably on the far right. And there is a soft Trump vote, like the union members we were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
who should not be forsaken in any sense. But we have to understand
Bless you.
that the 40% reality is here and it'll stay here, and how to deal with it. And I think we're probably only beginning to see now right-wing terrorism on a large scale. Now that it has martyrs, and now that the Democrats have taken power, the groups who led the charge into the Capitol, some of them are just inept. They're a bunch of brutal fools,
Mm-hmm.
but others aren't.
I agree.
I think we'll see more Timothy McVeigh's.
I agree. I agree. I kind of see that coming, and that was the one thing which was interesting when I heard. Well, I saw a lot of the comments on social media where people were kind of upset that there wasn't the Capitol Police taking shots at these people and this, that, and the other. And two factors I looked at it, I was like, well, first of all, these are the same people that were on the side of the police during the Kenosha protests when the cops shot that young man in the back 7 times. And
Well, one of the stories in the news media today is how many different cities there are investigations ongoing as to members of their police forces
who
participated in these events. It was a large number. There were a lot of cops.
Yeah, this was the Blue Lives Matter crowd out there.
Excuse me?
I said this was the Blue Lives Matter crowd that was out there for the most part.
Yeah. But cops themselves, I mean, I come from a large working class family, and one of my favorite grandnephews is a county sheriff in Washington, the state of Washington. And this is a guy who always had great kind of, not progressive, but liberal, tolerant values. And just seeing how the culture of policing changes those values. I mean, we all know, we've all ran into good cops at one time or another, but the police are an unchangeably reactionary and racist institution, even when people of color, minorities, make up a large proportion of the police, as in the instance of many of the the Capitol Police. So this makes it so imperative and important for all of us to renew our commitment to Black Lives Matter, but at the same time recognize that the target needs to be considerably widened to include not only the cops, but the whole criminal justice and penal system, as well. I mean, this is in some ways the most successful movement I've seen since the 1960s. And although, many of us would call for other coalitions and building other movements, as I pointed out earlier in the show about the need for a coalition to support essential workers. It's all important to continue the fight against the criminal justice system and police violence.
So do you think an organization like Black Lives Matter, I shouldn't say, I mean, they're kind of non-autonomous, but do you think movements like that can work with law enforcement to change law enforcement, or no?
Yeah, I mean, it requires considerable explanation and education of what we're talking about, but we shouldn't be on the defensive. Black Lives Matter an enormous impact. My wife, who works in the community colleges here in San Diego, wrote a resolution for her union, the AFT, for eliminating the campus police. Got overwhelming support. And this includes a lot of people who you would expect not to, embrace such an idea. But the experiences of the last, several years have had a deep impact. And that's why we need to challenge centrists and established Democrats who say, oh, this is killing us in the elections. This is a crazy demand. No, it's a reasonable and absolutely necessary demand to defund the police and refigure public safety in new and democratic ways.
I agree wholeheartedly. For those that'll be listening to the show for the first time, I've worked with the unhoused at one of the proper Operation Room Key shelters here in Oakland, California, and if anyone knows anything about that, to get into the shelters, you had to be part of a pretty high risk population in being homeless. So it wasn't just like they snatched up the first 10,000 homeless people they saw. You had to have either severe mental illness, chronic homelessness, like a diabetes or HIV. So generally you're dealing with a pretty hard to deal with segment of the population. And we didn't have a lot of resources for people. They pretty much just took the streets and threw you in a hotel and said, deal with it. And there were definitely situations where people had weapons, and things got violent, and law enforcement would have to be called. And you'd never want law enforcement to come to certain situations because you know how sometimes they can overreact. So when you call an officer because you have a person that you've done everything that you have been trained to do, everything you humanly possibly can do, but you're like, look, this person has a knife or a gun, and they're mentally ill, but I don't need the cops to come in here and put them down with a weapon. So I totally understand the need to change the way we look at law enforcement, especially when it comes to getting calls for people that are dealing with mental illness.
But we face a dilemma that was so almost insuperable during the 1960s, and that generalized police violence, particularly when it takes on a strategic form, that is part of a deliberate attempt to destroy movement organizations, like the COINTEL program targeted the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. You end up focusing everything on self-defense and on the police. And there's the danger of losing attention on the main targets, on the ruling institutions. In the 1960s in LA, that was an old guard power structure, savings and loans and the family that owned the Los Angeles Times, banks, and so on. And they essentially got a pass from protest because everyone was so deeply immersed in trying to preserve lives and movement groups from, police attacks.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to figure out how to deal with this situation where repression, even under Biden, is probably increasing. And we have to, defend ourselves. We have to, respond in the same heroic way BLM has to the police murders. But we need at the same time to try and figure out how we can keep publicity and activism also targeted on the actual ruling groups, whether that's the small city business elites, or whether on a national level, we're dealing with things like private equity and in hedge funds. So this is really a question of how simultaneously to give an anti-capitalist direction to the necessary struggles of the next year.
And this is where I wanted to read part of your recent essay that I got in Sidecar. Tomorrow, liberal pundits may reassure us that the Republicans have committed suicide, that the age of Trump is over, and that Democrats are on the verge of reclaiming hegemony. Similar declarations, of course, were made during vicious Republican primaries in 2015. They seemed very convincing at the time, but an open civil war amongst Republicans may only provide short-term advantages to Democrats, whose own divisions have been rubbed raw by Biden's refusal to share power with progressives. Freed from Trump's electronic fatwas, moreover, some of the younger Republican senators may prove to be much more formidable competitors for the white, college-educated suburban vote than centrist Democrats realize. In any event, the only future that we can reliably foresee, a continuation of extreme socioeconomic turbulence, renders political crystal balls useless. I love that, because on the show a few days ago, we were talking about the relationship now between neoconservatives, the Lincoln Project Republicans, and the neoliberals in the Democratic Party, and how they seem to be working together, maybe better than ever, to really silence the progressives.
If you saw the fulsome love note that Biden issued to McConnell, you realize how completely captive he is to this idea of restoring bipartisanship in Congress, and finding a working relationship with the Lincoln Project type Republicans. But I think this is a profound and dangerous illusion. And right now, what's happening is not so much that the Romneyites or the Lincoln Project people are regaining control of the Republican Party, as younger far-right Republicans who've broken with Trump are in a strong position not to restore, Nixonian or even Reaganite republicanism, but to preserve the far-right revolution, but on a basis that makes it more appealing, not only in suburbs, but some of these guys, and they're almost all guys, um, have different positions on immigration, and
Hmm.
undoubtedly are cheered by the success of Trump in November amongst evangelical, Latinos. So it remains to be seen how this, sorts itself out. But the Republican Party is undergoing a metamorphosis, not a disintegration. But the problem is that the Trump base, the hardcore Trump base, the 40% of voters that we've been talking about, uh, is unlikely to move very far. I did a kind of back of the envelope calculation about the election and about the 72 or 74 million Trump voters. And if you take this 40% figure, calculate that as a percentage of the Trump vote, you're still left with about 17 or 18 million voters who are critical of Trump but voted for him for some other reason. I think most likely fears about shutdowns and jobs and the general state of the economy. And these are people that could be recruited to the Republican Party that's represented in the Senate. There might be one back, particularly in blue collar cases, to the Democratic Party, depending on how active unions are and organizing campaigns are in the next period. But you're left still with what's basically a powerful neo-fascist minority in this country, which is important to understand better. But I mean, everything of the last 4 years shows us that that Trump was right about his infamous statement that he could go shoot somebody in the streets of New York
And
it
get
didn't
away with
bother his supporters at all. Well, in a way, he's shot hundreds of thousands of people in his handling of COVID. He's driven
it. Oh,
the country into to recession. But everything, the polls the last week can show that segment of his support hasn't changed, and this becomes, I think, will define a new age of political violence in this country.
so are you familiar with the work of Andres Malm? He wrote the book Corona, Climate, and Chronic Emergency.
Yes. I can't. I'm familiar with the work on a very superficial level.
He writes a book that I didn't see too many people talk about, and probably because a lot of it has to do with he wrote it. It came out during Corona. You couldn't do book tours around it and all that other stuff. But definitely kind of explains the fact that this is where we are in the world, that these things are going to be a lot more common. And you have been talking about this for a long time, zoonotic viruses and their relationship to us and our reluctance to really deal with it. And it being one of the bigger failures of capitalism, I would say.
Well, the current healthcare system in this country and the international public health institutions are really incapable of translating what is an absolutely historic revolution in biodesign, biotechnology, genetics into public health for the majority of people. A lot of ink will be spilled on how all this happened because the Trump administration dismantled the pandemic surveillance and response infrastructure that had been built up by the Bush and Obama administrations. But it goes so much further than that.
Mm-hmm.
If you look back at the history of campaigns against infectious disease, there are two different templates, two different camps. The dominant camp in this country and globally are militarized campaigns against specific pathogens or their carriers, their vectors, mosquitoes and so on. This model was originated in the U.S. Army's famous campaigns against yellow fever. After the Spanish-American War and during the building of the Panama Canal, the Rockefeller Institution hired many of these doctors and specialists. And from the end of the First World War down to the end of the Second World War, was the major actor on a global scale in campaigns against epidemic disease. And the Rockefeller model persists today. A good example of this was the Obama administration's campaign against Ebola in Western Africa, which included sending several thousand American troops. But there's another tradition, the tradition of social medicine, whose origin lies with some German doctors who were activists, revolutionaries in 1848. Rudolf Virchow, considered the father of pathology, was one of those revolutionaries. And his concept of social medicine was that you can go around kind of endlessly trying to combat, one pathogen or another. But the key thing is to build an infrastructure of primary medical care and public health on an encompassing scale. And to do that, you need to bring about basic reforms, agrarian reform, raising income and wages, and so on. And that model deeply influenced the classical socialist movement, and then the communist world. It was the Soviet Union who actually conceived the idea of a campaign against smallpox, but also married it to this concept of increasing health capacity through radical reform, particularly in poor countries. And the high point was 1978 or 79, when the World Health Organization conference in Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan adopted a declaration, now forgotten, which declared that health was a basic fundamental human right and should be the goal of the World Health Organization and the policies of all countries. So you have to ask yourself, well, we're going to have the vaccine eventually. There may be big problems with it if coronavirus continues to mutate. But even in the rich countries, particularly in the United States, and in the case of Tory Britain, we're still working with the wreckage of healthcare, public healthcare, left by a generation of cutbacks. For instance, 60,000 public health workers, people who work in county public health agencies and the like, lost their jobs after 2008. Those jobs had never been, refilled. So in the country that spends almost twice as much as other rich countries on medical care, we're working with a situation where a quarter of the population can expect only the most basic or primitive care, which expresses itself, of course, in the disproportionate mortality amongst African Americans,
Yes.
Latinos. But on a world scale, even if 2 years from now the vaccine finally is available in small farming communities in Africa and other poor parts of the world, the fundamental structural problem remains, and that's the absence of access to reliable, health care for hundreds of millions of human beings. Now, a final point about this is that the social medicine idea was actually probably developed most sophisticated way amongst the Latin American left, starting in the 1920s and 30s. And one of its greatest advocates, and he wrote several books about it, was Chile's Minister of Health during the short-lived Popular Front government in 1938 and 1939. This doctor's name was Salvador Allende.
Who later became president.
In health, although largely unknown to most of us, were absolutely fundamental in his life and in the Chilean Socialist Party.
I found an interview of you from a few months ago in Mother Jones, and you have a really interesting quote. You said it's a bit like the 1918 Spanish flu combined with the Great Depression. This is in reference to the pandemic. Americans went to bed one night in early March and woke up the next day to find out they were living in 1933. The difference, of course, is that policy has played a far greater role in this case than it did in 1918, even with the Great Depression. Hoover actually was extremely energetic in dealing with soaring unemployment after the stock market crash. What he did wasn't sufficient, but he was a famous engineer and a famous administrator of relief. So there's no comparison between Trump and Hoover. Trump has become the principal vector of coronavirus in this country, one might say even in the world, because of the way that others like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines followed his example.
Well, it might have been possible up to the end of April to attribute the disasters of our coronavirus response to the sheer ineptitude of the Trump administration. But beginning with the thuggish movement he launched against state governments and public health agencies, remember, Liberate Wisconsin, Liberate Michigan. Yes. It turned into an active war against public interventions against the disease. This is a criminal conspiracy by any definition. which is why it's so important that there is a full-scale, serious investigation of the conduct of the coronavirus campaign and the sabotage of the administration. This is what progressives in Congress need to fight for. And if Congress can't do it, then it needs to be done by some kind of citizens commission, drawing together experts from communities and experts on labor safety conditions with epidemiologists and so on. And it should indict people. If it was done in Congress, that would have some real power behind it. But even a citizens committee should keep in front of us the criminal liability of the Trump administration and also of private sector medicine, the corrupt private equity firms that dominate the long-term care industry. This is incomparably more serious than the attack on the Capitol.
I agree.
Or other crimes that Trump has been accused of. But I fear that the Biden administration will give it a pass in the same way that Obama gave a pass to Bush's war crimes. Certainly there'll be commissions and investigations and talk about that investigate what went wrong and what we should do different. But all of them most likely will avoid this question of guilt, of liability, of the criminal aspect of all of this.
Do you think, so here we are in the middle of a pandemic where we have tens of millions of American citizens that just don't have health care. In Lancaster early in the year, and I don't know why this story, still isn't resonating with people. There was a young man that didn't have the right insurance, left, and he was in good health. I think he was like 17, left the hospital, died on his way to the emergency room to the county hospital of coronavirus.
Well,
go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, what we're seeing, and sometimes confusing with the pandemic, is the result of 40 years or more since the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. 40 years of downsizing, of neglect of public health, putting hospital and medical insurance profits ahead of everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no better example of that than USC County General Hospital in Los Angeles, the major public hospital. It's been overwhelmed for decades. I have friends who work there as nurses and doctors, and the conditions have been appalling, seemingly from the beginning of time,
mm-hmm.
because the county either not raised the taxes or doesn't have the capacity to adequately fund it. And it's the shock absorber along with the jail system. As the jail system functions as a system of mental health incarceration, the public hospitals are the last resort of low-wage working people, and people who now express surprise that the system is collapsing. The ICU capacity in Southern California is exactly zero right now. In other words, the totally overwhelmed. They're conducting, very frightening triage procedures where people who look to be really mortally ill, ambulance crews have been told not to bring them into hospitals.
Yeah, that's
People who doctors seem probably be unsaving or being disconnected from their respiratory apparatus to make way for others. I mean, the full horror of this rests on a basis of a privatized and greedy private healthcare system and a public healthcare system that in so many ways has been run into the ground. Of course, something very similar has occurred in Great Britain. I lived in Northern Ireland and London for most of the 1980s. And as someone who never had health care before, it was just amazing to have this quality free medicine, to pay almost nothing for prescriptions and so on. But the flagship of the accomplishments of the British labor movement, National Health Service, had been run into the ground by several decades of Tory privatizations and downsizing. You see clearly, the results from those. So there's a great danger of just focusing on the immediate crisis and ignoring the structural crisis, which is the context in which this is happening. So Medicare for all, single payer, national health insurance is more urgent than ever. It was a shock to me, as I'm sure it was to many of your listeners, when negotiators for the Sanders camp at the end of March, or maybe it was early April, accepted and made a concession to the Biden camp of his version of Obamacare with a public option, which is a failed and totally inadequate response. We have to make sure that there continues to be a national struggle over this. I mean, every poll has shown that overwhelmingly the majority of people, including many Trump supporters, understand and demand Medicare for all. The danger is that the cause of so-called democratic unity will marginalize it, as with the rest of the agenda advanced by Sanders and by Elizabeth Warren. But we need to fight this also, particularly on a local level. One of the tragic effects of the way the pandemic has been managed is that so many smaller hospitals are going bankrupt or closing down. Fiscal austerity dictates the continuing reduction of public sector jobs, including in public health. So rather than energetically rebuilding primary and emergency care, we're continuing to downsize it and to dismantle it, leaving us more vulnerable than ever to the next pandemic, whether that's avian flu or something totally unsuspected like the coronavirus is.
And that's another failure of the system that we're in currently, because wasn't there a lot of research that was being done during the Bush Jr. administration about finding a vaccine for some of these zoonotic diseases?
Well, the problem is that there are some very important vaccines. There was a vaccine developed for SARS, for instance, the coronavirus, relative of our our current virus, but big pharma makes it so often made it impossible to produce these vaccines on scale, or even create stocks of candidate vaccines that have already been tested, because the very nature of big pharma, it sells itself as the industry which guarantees our health, that develops new drugs and treatments. But in fact, the larger part of the budget, a larger part of the budget of the big pharmaceutical firms goes to advertising,
Not research and development.
not to research. The industry focuses on the highest profit medicines, medicines for heart disease or diabetes, or for the sexual dysfunction of elderly males like me. I've had health problems in recent years, and after an operation, developed one of these antibiotic-resistant hospital infections, bacterial infections that nearly killed me. About 30,000 people a year die from these. The whole antibiotic revolution is being rolled back for the lack of research and expenditure to develop new generation antibiotics and, of course, antivirals. What Big Pharma does is it buys up research, which often was developed first in public universities and licensed to smaller pharmaceutical or biotech companies, often run by faculty members of those universities. It buys that up, sometimes not for the purpose of using the research to develop new products, but to prevent those products from coming on the market because they compete with the far more expensive existing jobs. In other words, the big pharma industry are essentially rentiers, okay, who use patents to extract huge profits, but have abdicated the fundamental research was the basis of their legitimacy. So big pharma, in a sense, is a major part of the problem. They only really do these things and their profits are guaranteed, like the billions of dollars have been thrown at the big pharmaceutical companies by the Trump administration. And if you look at something like the Moderna vaccine, so much of this is research that, again, came out of public universities. It's backed up by $1 billion federal investment, yet taxpayers get no return from the sales of these vaccines. Company keeps all the profits of a product that was developed so largely by tax dollars and the public sector. That's an outrageous situation.
And we're also seeing, I don't know if I don't know how recent this article was. It was in a Canadian publication that South Africa isn't getting any of the Moderna vaccine, that they sold a bunch to Canada and a bunch to the European Union and a bunch to the United States. And South Africa, where there's like 1 million coronavirus cases. I forget how many deaths South Africa has had, but they're the most in Africa. And they're not getting any help whatsoever from Moderna. Not even, I shouldn't say help. They're not even able to purchase anything from Moderna.
Well, I mean, on one level, in terms of medical research, we've seen an astonishing common sharing of data and collaboration between researchers and medical workers across the world, led first of all by the fact that Chinese researchers have exploited their huge database on coronavirus and shared it with others, which has sped up the development of vaccines. So you have this example of a scientific public commons, just as it should be. But in everything else, ruled by pure nationalism. Now, the European countries have agreed to contribute a small amount of money to make vaccines available in poorer countries, sometimes only on a symbolic scale. But the United States has tried to corner the world market in vaccines at the expense of other countries, and particularly poor countries. It's been widely estimated in the medical press that it may be at least 2 years before poor countries began to have vaccines available. And the situation in Africa as a whole is really out of control. The first wave, the spring-summer wave, was less horrendous than I think most people expected. But right now it's turned into a conflagration on a continent where malnutrition, the absence of sanitation and clean water make so many people immune suppressed and vulnerable to the pandemic. The World Health Organization, which is supposed to be the lead agency in international response, of course, it's been marginalized, partially because it's been hollowed out over the years by the failure of countries to make the contributions that they're signatory to. So leaving the World Health Organization dependent on alliances with a few major countries, big pharma, and some private philanthropies like the Gates Foundation. So essentially, on global level, the whole effort is disintegrated into, each man running for its lifeboats. The exception is that the Chinese are beginning to distribute, large quantities of their vaccine. The Russians also, to some extent. But the American case is simply the most terrible and the most criminal. Now, I've argued for a long time that the prospects for an American left have never been stronger. There's a very great danger on the left of inversing our own radical version of America Firstism. I think there's unmistakably been a decline in internationalism. And the place to begin with all this is fighting for aid to poor countries and renewing the principles of the Alma Ata Declaration on healthcare as a universal human right.
And I look at the Cuban doctors that have done such a great job globally, sending those doctors all over the world to help. Was it Italy they went to and really got the numbers down there, and they were the only people to take on that ship that had a ship full of people that had COVID on it. So, and I think didn't they even ask to come to the States and we wouldn't let them come in?
Well, the Cubans are always heroic in these circumstances and punching far above their weight. What happened in Italy was that although the European Union leaves healthcare to the individual nations, it has a protocol, a treaty that requires countries to send aid and support to other countries in the event of natural disasters, including pandemics. Italy, last late March or April, invoked that protocol, and the response was that the French closed the borders and forbade the export of any French medicines or resources. Likewise with Germany and other countries. In other words, the EU totally collapsed into nationalism on this question. And the only relief that came, the only aid that came, was the Chinese sent several plane loads of medicines and experts. But above all, the Cubans. I think that probably the least known story of all this is the case of Andorra. Andorra is basically a valley in the Pyrenees that's notionally independent and kind of jointly ruled by Spain and in France. It developed as particularly because Spanish construction workers in Andorra, it developed a huge outbreak in this tiny place of coronavirus. The French would not aid Andorra. The Spanish would not aid Andorra. But the Cubans immediately sent 20 doctors to Andorra. Wherever there is a major outbreak or epidemic crisis, the Cubans are always there. And we should also recall that in the Western Hemisphere, it's Cuba, not Brazil or Mexico, which has the most innovative and advanced medical research in Latin America, third only to the United States and Canada. Cubans have made astonishing breakthroughs in designing new treatments and vaccines through diseases, particularly tropical diseases. Should have been a Cuban doctor on the front page of Time magazine's Person of the Year.
Well, it looks like zoonotic diseases are going to be stuck with us for some time. They're not going to go away once we get a vaccine. And do you feel like Americans were kind of waiting for Superman, if you will, when it came to the vaccine and not really taking heed to any, and a lot of this has to do with the federal level, social distancing and masking?
Well, again, because of the absence of a powerful solidarity movement with essential workers and healthcare workers, and the very weak response of the Democrats, people simply have not been educated, first of all, about the underlying structural conditions of underfunding and disinvestment in healthcare, the role of big pharma, nor about the nature of the new relationship between human societies and animal viruses. In my old book, Monster at the Door, written in 2005 about the threat of avian flu, I cite a study which I consider to be the absolutely remarkable example of how these new diseases emerge. And in a nutshell, it looked at the case of urban West Africa. West Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing and also the youngest area on Earth. Traditionally, urban West Africans consume protein largely in the form of fish. 35 years ago, the big factory fleets from Western Europe and Japan moved into the Gulf of Guinea. And the researchers estimate they simply vacuumed up half of the fish mass in the Gulf of Guinea. Not to put fish and chips on the table of wealthier countries, but most of it was used simply to feed as feedstock for poultry. So prices of fish soared. Several million local fishermen lost their jobs, found themselves bankrupt. At the same time, multinational logging companies clear-cutting the great tropical rainforests in Cameroon, Gabon. To reduce labor costs, they began hiring hunters to feed their logging crews. And the hunters basically killed anything that was potentially edible, from snakes to monkeys. Because of the food crisis, particularly in the slums of urban West Africa, they also began to sell to people in the cities, and this became a major part of the diet in the cities. So here you have two very large-scale, profit-driven industries exploiting natural resources, and in the case of logging, breaking down the barriers, the kind of protective builder defenses between human communities and huge reservoirs of animal viruses. The growth of slums created enormous vulnerable populations lacking sanitation and so on. I mean, these are the conditions under which Ebola evolved and spread, and likely HIV as well. So the preservation of tropical forests, massive aid to family agriculture, so that poor farmers don't essentially cut and burn in forest areas. These are essential steps that need to be taken. I mean, capitalism mines the planet in a comprehensive sense, and is responsible in large part for the increasing prevalence of diseases, which viruses, in some cases bacteria and fungus, that jump from animals and plants to humans. And of course, as Rob Wallace has pointed out so brilliantly in his book on factory farming, factory farms are the ultimate incubators and accelerators, like particle accelerators of disease emergence. You know, when you have 100,000 pigs on a single hog farm, or millions of chickens in giant factory setups, you could not think of a more diabolical situation for the kind of genetic transfers and infections that accelerate the evolution of pathogenic viruses in new diseases. I mean, some people, you know, some of us have a problem of ascribing everything in the world to capitalism, but in the case of disease emergence on almost every level, it's the for-profit sector, the corporate sector, that is directly indicted in what has become a new age of pandemics. and we're not that far away from the next pandemic. Right now, there's a bird pandemic going on globally, leading to the culling of millions and millions of birds. 10 European countries, East Asia, many parts of Africa. And the pathogenic subtypes involved in the death of birds pass from wild birds to domestic birds, and vice versa. Include, for instance, H5N1, which is what my book was about, and in which I've been the chief worry and chief candidate for a pandemic for the last 20 years. That threat has not diminished in any way. An avian flu pandemic, it should be far more deadly than coronavirus, is not a matter of if, but when. Lots of researchers would use the term imminent.
Do you think, because I feel like Americans are still split on the severity of coronavirus, and a lot of that has to do with, and I don't want to get too much into it with, again, the administration's kind of mishandling and downplaying of it early on, but we're almost at 400,000 people that aren't here with us anymore because of coronavirus. Do you think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there hasn't been like AIDS? I remember when Rock Hudson passed away and how that really made people realize that AIDS was real and it wasn't relegated to a certain subset of society. Has there been that moment for COVID yet?
Well, I think for the majority of people, yes. But the kind of denialism that ignores the vaccine, that encourages not wearing masks, that believes that the Democrats are running a child pornography ring out of an Italian restaurant in a Washington suburb, that thinks that Antifa actually were the ones who trashed the Capitol. I mean, this is these kinds of delusions are, in fact, a form of a fatal disease. Nobody knows what the real cure for that is, except for the fact that all this has been incubated and spread within closed media environments dominated by right-wing radio and Fox News, and now Fox's far-right successors. So the decline of independent journalism and smaller daily newspapers in the country, and the establishment of this informational monopoly over so much of rural and small-town America is an essential part of all this. I mean, my wife and my youngest son are constantly showing, because they're on their cell phones or their computer all the time, constantly showing me absolutely bizarre rumors and factoids that are rapidly circulating, and we have to recognize that we really haven't created a popular culture of science in this country. I mean, you end up with the fact that the guy who owns the Creation Science Museum here in eastern San Diego County is a biochemist, or that there's so many doctors and healthcare workers who buy into parts of these theories, who won't take a virus or believe that coronavirus was a biochemical weapon developed in a Chinese laboratory.
Yeah, I saw, which is frightening, very frightening. Well, I feel like I've taken up too much of your time as it is, because you only had so much time, and I appreciate you going over with us. I appreciate all the work that you've done and continue to do. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Is there anything you want to say before we end the episode?
No, it's simply that it's been an honor to speak to your audience, and that Oakland and East Bay, remain one of the really thrilling and important centers of activism in this country. And thanks to your show and so many other things, I'm sure that will continue. So, all power to the East Bay.
Thank you, Mike. Don't hang up. I want to play some music. Don't hang up.